But that only tells part of the story.
Sup, sobers. Why do we get dressed up for Halloween? And where did Halloween even come from? When did we start passing out candy to kids like this? Cultures all around the world celebrate things similar to Halloween, but the Halloween that we know it as it exists in America today dates back to Celtic traditions in Ireland and Scotland. They marked the date from October 31st to November 1st as being the end of summer and the beginning of winter, which is obviously very important in a big farming area. They also believed that during this time period, the boundary between the dead and the living world was very, very thin. So not only could priests predict things that were going to happen in the future, but also ghosts and entities from the other side were able to cross over and walk the earth freely, according to legend. In order to celebrate this holiday, priests would all gather out. They'd make these big bonfires. They would be carving gourds into lanterns, aka jack-o'-lanterns. They were doing this to keep away Stingy Jack, and apparently this guy couldn't cross over into the afterlife, but he also wasn't allowed into heaven, so he was forever just banished to walk the earth, I guess. And in order to scare him off and keep him away, essentially they would carve these gourds and make these lanterns out of them because he wouldn't go wherever the light was. Kind of an interesting tale as to why jack-o'-lanterns came about. They would have a giant feast around these bonfires, and because the bonfires were so big and hot, they'd attract all these bugs. There's bats flying around all over eating these bugs, so bats forever became associated with the holiday. It just kind of went hand in hand. And not only that, but people that would gather would all dress in different disguises and costumes so that if there was any entities that crossed over and they were walking the earth, then they would be disguised. They wouldn't be able to be recognized. And so it's kind of a way for them to hide essentially from these ghosts. Now, as Christianity began to spread throughout Ireland and Scotland and that whole area, a lot of the pagan traditions that they practiced started to fade out and started to die. And one of those was the Halloween, it was called Samhain. It's one of the ones that didn't necessarily fade out, but it's something that they just thought was a little bit too extreme. It didn't align with the Christian values. And so they kept this tradition, and as Christianity began to spread and people began to adopt the religion, then they slowly changed this holiday to be a little bit more toned down. There wasn't as much having to do with ghosts. There wasn't as much having to do with spirits and things like that. It was more about just celebrating the season change and celebrating this time period of moving from summer to winter. It said that it kind of, watered it down a little bit, made it a little bit more PG, toned it down. And during this time period, they called it All Hallows Eve. Once they toned it down, they really wanted to change the name from Samhain to something a little bit more contemporary, something a little bit more Christian. And so they changed it to All Souls Day. And since November 1st is marked as All Hallows Day, it eventually became All Hallows Eve. And then eventually it was just shortened to Hallows Eve or Halloween. Now, as we know, America is a massive melting pot, and a lot of people came over from Ireland and Scotland. And they brought their traditions and their culture with them as well. And so one of those cultures and traditions they brought was this Halloween holiday. And it didn't really take hold until about the 19th century when a massive wave of Irish and Scottish immigrants came through. And up until that point, it was just kind of like a lightly practiced holiday here and there, but it was nothing official. But with the melting pot of America, a lot of people seem to celebrate this holiday, maybe in different facets, but they all celebrate this time period, this change from summer to winter, and this marked period of this boundary thinning between the afterlife and this current life. It's interesting how so many cultures share one similar holiday, even though they practice it all differently. And once it gets to America, things kind of change and the holiday becomes a little bit more dark. Kids start using this holiday to go out and scare neighbors. It starts to become a holiday where instead of taking advantage and celebrating, it becomes something where people are taking advantage of the dark energy. They're going out harassing other people, and it just started to become a problem. And so in order to kind of curve the holiday into a better direction, they came up with this idea of having kids go door to door and trick or treat. There's a lot of different myths as to how trick or treating itself came about, but the actual idea and the The motivation to do it was to try and help keep kids out of trouble on this night mostly, which I think it mildly works, but the older you get, there's really nothing else to do. I mean, you can go trick or treat, but when you're done with that, once it's actually dark, then you're going to go cause trouble. One tradition that did stay throughout the course of Halloween all the way up into current time period is the jack-o'-lantern. They used to carve out potatoes and smaller gourds and things like that. But once they got to North America, they realized that pumpkins are everywhere, and these pumpkins are the perfect things to make these jack-o'-lanterns out of. And so that's a tradition that's maintained all the way up until today. Another tradition that's maintained all the way up until today was the tradition of wearing disguises or costumes. At some point, they decided that the costumes of being priests and these church-like figures was no longer fun for the kids, and the kids started dressing like ghouls and goblins and scary things so that they could scare their neighbors and scare their family. But that tradition is maintained all the way up into our contemporary holiday. Even still, every single year, you'll see multiple kids throwing on masks, dressing in their costumes. But there's another mask that only gets put on about once a year, and that mask is the spit mask that Esteban Carpio has to wear. Now, this mask is only used on average about 10 times in 10 years, according to the reports from this police department. So that average about once a year. About the same as Halloween, right? But this mask obviously looks like the Hannibal Lecter mask. They only really have to break it out in certain situations when the defendant or the person being arrested is acting extremely combative. And in Esteban Carpio's case, he was definitely that. Esteban Carpio was born July 30th, 1978 in Boston, Massachusetts, and he had a pretty rough upbringing. Sounds like he had a really abusive father. His dad was addicted to substances, and he was also an alcoholic, and he struggled with mental health, which is probably why he was an addict. And then obviously his mom was in an abusive relationship, and unfortunately she didn't really offer a whole lot of support. There was a lot of dysfunction, a lot of arguing in the family, and it just, it always kind of pushed Esteban away and kind of made him feel really isolated from the family. Eventually, Esteban's dad would finally just up and leave one day and never return. That would leave Esteban kind of on his own, and instead of kind of turning more towards family, he started turning more towards friends. And he was growing up in kind of a rough ghetto in the Boston area, and so naturally he's going to find some trouble. In order to try and escape this rough home situation, Esteban really threw himself into poetry, music. He really loved dancing. And I don't know, he just seemed like he really enjoyed a lot of art kind of things. He's a very artsy kind of a guy. Esteban went to school at Blackstone High School, and he was not really the best student. And in fact, he actually ended up dropping out once he hit junior year. It was around this same time he was starting to get kind of involved with some friends, and the friends that he had were involved in some local gangs. And because he was involved with these local gang groups, he started to get into more trouble and started to get into trouble with the law. He was getting in trouble for things like substance distribution, weapons. It said that he was actually involved with the unaliving of another gang member, assault, robbery, and above everything else, they say that he actually had pimped out his girlfriend. He was kind of forcing her to go out and perform this sex work to bring home money for him. And this is something that obviously traumatized her, because even after he was out of the picture, she still continued to do this. Things didn't really start to turn around for Esteban until he met a young lady named Sammy and Finn. Things were going really well for the both of them, and they ended up having 2 daughters. And this is really the turning point for Esteban. He starts to realize that he wants something more out of life. He starts to realize he wants to be a good father. He wants to be a good husband, good partner. And he starts to really try and focus on just doing the best he can to be a good dad around this time period. And that lasts for quite a while. In fact, everybody that knew him was kind of a little bit frightened with the direction that he was starting to go down, with all this gang activity, being in trouble with the law. Even though very few of his run-ins with the law actually resulted in him, being incarcerated at all or having to face any charges for anything, it's still something that they saw this path, and they knew that if he kept going down this path, it's only going to lead to worse things. It's believed during this time period that he took a break from using any substances, and he was actually kind of going through a period of sobriety. And so that's likely something that added to him starting to do better and starting to feel better and starting to be able to live life fairly normally. Likely from his substance use in his past, Esteban would go through these periods where he would hear voices. He would have extreme paranoia, and it was so bad that he would actually complain about it to his partner Samian and his mom, and Just a lot of people knew that this was something that he struggled with. But anytime that he was ever admitted, it was likely just attributed back to his substance use. He would go through periods of sobriety since he would be incarcerated for short periods of time. But then once he was out, it's assumed he would go right back to it. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a whole lot about his actual substance use or any of his addiction issues, but he did have multiple drug charges, and in his own autobiography, he talks about how he was a substance peddler. So he himself admits that it is something that he was doing, and it seems like when he had his periods of sobriety is when he started to see some success and things were starting to improve. Things continue to be really, really good for Esteban up until April of 2005. On April 2nd, he is over at his mom's house, and his mom is so concerned for him. He says he's hearing voices and having this psychotic episode. She's so concerned, she reaches out and calls 911 and gets an ambulance over to actually transport him over to Faulkner Hospital. Once he gets there, he doesn't have medical insurance, and essentially the hospital kind of turns him away, and they don't really see any reason to treat him. However, 11 days later, on April 13th in 2005, he's admitted again by his mom. They drive him all the way down to Rhode Island Hospital, hoping maybe for a different result from the other hospital. And once they get him admitted, they take him in, they do some tests, they do some scans, do some evaluations on him. And what they decide is that he does need to be admitted to a mental hospital, and they come up with a schedule and a plan for treatment. But they attribute his psychosis and his mental breakdown and his mental illness issues to substance use. They say that it's likely substance use related mental illness stuff. Essentially, he's using substances and making himself paranoid. He's causing schizophrenic tendencies, paranoia, all of the things that substances are known to do when you're abusing them. Because they decide it's substance related, they decide to put him on an outpatient treatment program, and they get him all scheduled and everything figured out, but he is released. He's not held in any way, he's not kept, he's not evaluated further, and nothing further is done, essentially. And I would imagine the hospital staff wouldn't have done that if they didn't truly believe that he was just struggling with a substance abuse issue, and likely he needed to go through substance use treatment. One thing I do want to note about this, though, is that both of these times he was admitted, it was both his mom and his girlfriend, Samian, that had admitted him. Unless it's you that is admitting yourself, you're not acknowledging that you have a problem. And likely he probably didn't. He probably didn't even tell them that he was using these substances, and they actually thought that it was a legit mental health episode, when really it was a substance-related episode. Everything would take a dark, dark turn on April 15th of 2005. Esteban had to take Samian to a job interview. She was an escort, so I'm not sure if she was being interviewed for an escort job or if she was actually escorting with somebody. But he dropped her off. After he had dropped her off, he's just kind of driving around. And while he's driving around, he happens to notice this older lady. She's 84 years old. Her name's Madeline Gatta. He just gets this urge out of nowhere and decides that he is going to go rob this poor old lady and take her purse. Maybe it's just because she was such a vulnerable person in that moment, coupled with the fact that he's feeling these intense urges and saying that he's having this mental episode of hearing voices pushing him to do these things. Esteban decides he's going to take advantage of this poor, vulnerable 84-year-old woman, and he's going to steal her purse and any valuables she's got. So he throws on a ski mask and he heads over and he creeps up behind her and punches her as hard as he can in the back. And she kind of falls over. After he stabs her, he kind of just paces back and forth a little bit, talking to himself, looking really confused. And then he takes the purse, runs off, hops into his red van, and then blazes out. Now, there was somebody in the area, innocent bystander, that happened to see everything go down. And they immediately called it in. And this bystander was on their game because they got the license plate number of this van that Carpio was in and sent it into police, making things easy for him. Way to go, innocent bystander. I mean, how often you get a license plate number? The escort job that she's on takes a little bit over an hour, maybe an hour and a half, and she has no idea where Esteban is during this time period. Roughly 2 o'clock when all this happens, but Esteban calls up Samian and says, hey, I can't pick you up. Can you get somebody else to pick you up? And she says, no, you need to pick me up. I'm done. I'm ready to be picked up. Please come get me right now. So he begrudgingly decides, okay, so he races over there back to the restaurant he dropped her off at. He picks her up. From there, she wanted to head over to the Providence Mall, but he says, no, I don't want to go over to the Providence Mall. Like, if we're going to go over there, we need to head back to the house and switch cars. That's kind of a weird request. If my partner got in the car after not seeing her for an hour and was like, we need to go back to the house and switch cars, I'd be like, okay, number one, what'd you do to the car? And if nothing's done to the car, then what did you do? But she doesn't do that. She says, okay, sure, let's go back and switch cars. La-di-da. And then they go to the Providence Mall from there. Because police are equipped with this license plate number, they can track it pretty easily. And they find out that the car is a leased vehicle, and it is in Sammy and Finn's name. So short work there. They head over to Sammy and Finn's house, and they knock on the door, and they start asking about, where is Esteban? Because they don't think that she committed this crime, and Esteban's listed as an authorized driver on the account. They also find out that he has a revoked Massachusetts driver's license and a suspended Rhode Island driver's license. So he shouldn't even have been driving anyways. Why was she having him drive her to her work event? Maybe she just needed somebody. Oh, that's right, because he's her pimp. Initially, she was reluctant to hand over Esteban to the police, but because of what they accuse him of, she finally convinces him that, hey, look, they're just here to try and help you. And she convinces him to actually, go with these police officers and go down for questioning. Now, cops arrest him without incident. Everything goes fairly smoothly. The ride over to the police station, down to the Providence police station, actually is fairly uneventful. And once they get inside, they bring him into an interrogation room where detectives want to question him about this poor 84-year-old woman who was just robbed by a person who had his license plate and description. Once they got him in this conference room, they uncuff him. They, try and let him know, make yourself comfortable. We're just waiting on the lead detective, Detective James Allen, to show up. And once he gets here, then we'll go ahead and get into why you're here. And they're just kind of engaging in small talk, banter back and forth, just kind of making sure that he feels comfortable so that hopefully it'll encourage him to want to talk. Finally, Detectives Allen and Detective McGann both show up, and they, close the door. They are both armed at this point, and they just start asking him some basic background questions. And Esteban immediately starts lying right away. He says that his name is Bosalino Carr. He says that he's a barber from Boston, which is probably the only true thing he told them. And he says he has no criminal record and has no idea why he's there. But Detective Allen and Detective McGann, they're not going to take any bullshit from this guy. So they're like, look, man, we know that that's all a lie. We know that you're not telling us the truth. We know who you are, and you're in some serious trouble. Obviously, Esteban gets super uncomfortable. His whole plan just went right out the window. So he realizes that he's not going to fool these guys. And so he starts to get really agitated, really fidgety. And then he asks the cops, like, hey, can you guys just get me a glass of water? And so Detective McGann says, like, yeah, sure. I'll go and I'll grab you a glass of water. I'll be right back. He leaves. And once he leaves, Detective Allen locks the door behind him so that it's just Detective Allen and Esteban in this interrogation room, which normally these are videotaped interrogation rooms. So I'm not sure why there was no videotape or video evidence going on during this time period, but there is no video evidence of what happens next. Now, when Detective McGann gets back with this cup of water for Esteban, he's met with a locked door that he can't get into, and he hears the sounds of a struggle inside. He has no idea what's going on, but it sounds like a violent struggle. There's lots of screaming, and he hears Detective Allen yell, "He's going to kill me. He's got my gun." The next thing Detective McGann hears is the sound of 2 gunshots. They start yelling, screaming, "Detective Allen, are you okay?" They're trying to get his attention. They're trying to figure out if he's still in there, if everything's all right. What's going on? But the door's locked. They can't do anything about it. They have no idea what's going on. Detective McGann immediately backs up, draws his weapon, and is ready for Esteban to come right through that door. He's like, he's going to unlock this door and be barging through any second. I need to be ready to take him down. A minute or so goes by, nobody shows up. And after about a minute or two, they hear a couple more gunshots. And it sounds like some glass shattered. But the door's locked. They can't get inside. They have no idea what's going on in this room. And they have no way of finding anything out because Detective Allen's not responding to any of their requests. It takes 3 battering ram attempts. They finally get this door busted in. And when they finally get into the room, they see Detective Allen unalived on the ground with two gunshot wounds, and he is unresponsive. The other thing they see is the window has been shot out, and there's a giant hole in the window. Esteban shot out the window and made a jump for it. But they're on the 3rd story of this police station, so he had to fall 3 stories out of this window and landed in a grassy knoll just down below. It's freaking Ted Bundy all over again, man. Luckily, when all this happened, there was some people outside that saw everything go down. They saw what looked to be a man standing on the 3rd floor of this building shoot out this glass and then push the glass out of the window. Then he goes out on the ledge and then hangs down, drops down as far as he can before dropping 3 stories into the grass below. He drops Detective Allen's weapon that he used and takes off. He bolts down the street. He goes down this bridge and then kind of just disappears from there. The people that saw him, they say that he was wearing dark clothing, possibly jeans and maybe a bomber jacket, and they kind of give the police the direction that he headed. So gives him a starting place anyways. From here, Esteban heads to a friend's house. Her name's Harmony Boise, and she lives not too far from the police station. And he shows up unannounced to her apartment, and she doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't tell her anything that just happened, but he's got blood all over his hands, and he looks like in disarray, and she's very confused, but he says, you got to help me out. I need your help. You need to hide me. And so she does for about 15-20 minutes. She keeps him in her house, but she's starting to get really uncomfortable, feeling really confused. And then Esteban starts talking about how he needs to get a taxi and he needs to get out of town immediately. Esteban asks Harmony to call him a taxi cab because he needs to get out of town. He needs to get to New York City. And he tells her, I've got $500. Tell him I'll give him $500 to get me out of here. So she does. She tells this taxi driver that this guy's got $500 for fare, and he's willing to pay that to get this ride to New York City. And so the dispatcher sends a taxi driver over, and the news has just broke about Detective Allen being shot. And unfortunately, he didn't make it. So news is spreading like wildfire, and this taxi driver is aware of what's going on. So it's something that the dispatcher advises him to just be cautious, especially with this kind of suspicious $500 situation. Like, that's not normal. And so as he gets closer and closer to where he is supposed to be picking up Esteban, he sees a lot of police blockades, tons of police cars, just things that make him feel really uneasy, give him real bad feelings inside of his stomach. So he decides, I better be safe as opposed to sorry. So he stops and talks to a police officer that's in the near area and lets him know exactly what's going on with this $500 fare, and he thinks that this could be the guy they're looking for. So they tell him, look, lock your doors, go to the call, pick this guy up like normal, and then we will take it from there. So that's what he does. He rolls up, he shows up to pick up Esteban. Esteban meets eyes with the taxi driver, and then immediately just notices that something's up, and he bolts. He takes off as fast as he can, but the cops are onto him, they're chasing him. And they catch up to him finally, and they're able to subdue him, but he is being combative. It said that he was resisting arrest, he was spitting on the officers, he was punching, kicking, screaming, biting, doing all of the things he could possibly do to try and avoid arrest. And so for that reason, they beat the living shit out of him. I mean, they said they hit him 3 times, is what the official report said. But they beat the shit out of this guy.
The air just kind of went out of the room for a second as everybody's eyes were transfixed on Esteban Carpio. They wanted to see, the man they perceived to be a monster who could have done this.
And when Carpio walks in, there are cries of shock and horror. Carpio's mask is called a spit shield and is typically used when a suspect is either bleeding or combative. Police say the suspect was being combative, spitting on them. But his relatives think the mask is covering up a revenge beating Carpio took at the hands of police.
It's police brutality. He was mentally ill and he needed help and we couldn't get it. We tried and tried. And he didn't deserve this.
An investigation conducted by the FBI later concludes Carpio sustains his wounds from a combination of smashing through the window, falling 3 stories, and the use of necessary force to apprehend the fleeing suspect.
There is no civil rights violation when injuries are incident to arrest.
Can we get a fuck yeah for the taxi driver guy? Because way to go, dude. Like, that's some serious listening to your intuition right there. And your body knows before your brain knows that things are going wrong or things are not right. So listen to that feeling, you guys. He did, and he's a freaking hero because of it. Although he is $500 less rich than he would have been. But I guess, From here, Carpio's taken to a hospital, and police take that opportunity to question him. They ask him, why did he do it? What happened? He claims he has no memory of what happened. He says that a friend of his started making him go crazy. He was hearing voices. He just has all of these things that he says were leading him to feel this intense paranoia while he was in that interrogation room, so much that he thought Detective Allen was going to unalive him, so he felt like he needed to act first or he was going to be the victim. When they ask him why he locked the door, he says, "I don't know, I just felt like I had to do it." And when they ask him why he tried to escape, he said he was just in fear for his life. He really thought that these guys were out to get him. So he unalived Detective Allen and then took his weapon and just found the only way out, which was through the window. And he said he was just in fear for his life. Maybe that's true, but probably not because he was in fear from being unalived. He was probably in fear for his life because he knew he was going to be spending the rest of it in prison. Now, most of the stories I cover seem to be not guilty by reason of insanity cases, and I'm not intentionally doing that. I think that the link between intense substance abuse, mental health disorders, and mental health issues and crime, that is likely going to be the only defense that you even really have. There's no way he can say he didn't do it. There's no way that he can say that, like, he didn't mean for it. It wasn't self-defense. Like, he has no argument. The only defense he has is not guilty by reason of insanity. And of course, that comes with multiple psych evaluations and, just a long process of trying to analyze, was he or was he not crazy and insane at the time of the unalivings and the crimes? And it's always the same story. The defense has their experts who say, yes, he's definitely insane. He's got paranoid schizophrenia. He's bipolar. He's got multiple personality disorders. He's got all of these things which could lead to voices in your head, which could lead to unaliving, which could lead to exactly what he has. The state has their own evaluations done by a different doctor. And of course, their doctor says, no, he's malingering, which malingering means faking it. He's just doing these things to make it seem like he's crazy. And not only that, but he doesn't exhibit any true signs of somebody who was actually insane at the time of the crime. He took all of these precautions trying to avoid getting caught. He took precautions to leave that interrogation through unaliving the police officer. He intentionally asked the other officer to leave the room so that he could go get a glass of water, leaving Detective Allen more vulnerable. It just seems like somebody who was not necessarily having a psychotic episode. It seems like somebody who was panicking and doing their very best to evade the law. Also, I just want to bring up, he had this period where things were going so well, and it was right after he had his children. And so after having kids, people tend to sober up and start doing better because they put their kids first. But once that starts to get a little bit routine and you get a little used to that whole lifestyle, then you start to open yourself back up to some of those old habits again. It's very possible, and it's very likely that Esteban had started using again without telling anybody. And his substance use is what led to him starting to feel paranoid, exhibit these schizophrenic symptoms, and to, I guess, quote unquote, hear these voices in his head. There's no proof one way or the other. I couldn't find any toxicology reports from his arrests saying that he was or was not on anything. They say that during the interrogation with Detective Allen, he did not appear to be on any substances, but that just because he doesn't appear to be doesn't mean he wasn't. It's very likely and very possible that he started using again, and because he started using again, that's what led to him kind of experiencing this psychotic episode. It's substance-induced psychosis. Like I've mentioned before, the not guilty by reason of insanity defense very rarely works. It works in about 1% of cases, and it's just not a really good defense. You have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you were in fact insane at the time of the crime. And that's not just like, was he acting a little crazy? You have to satisfy the legal defense of insanity, which is a whole lot more strict. It has to show that you did not understand that your actions were wrong at that time. And usually things like that are only going to be shown through you having zero remorse, doing absolutely insane things after the crime to where it doesn't even seem like you realize you did something wrong. And that isn't this case. This case has so many pieces afterwards where Esteban tried to evade the law that it's just, it's impossible to think that he was just completely insane and had no idea what he was doing and how wrong it was. But the trial for this case is really where things get crazy, and it attracts a lot of national attention, not only because he unalived a police officer, but the video of Esteban coming into the courtroom after being arrested for these crimes and having to be arraigned and face the judge. his face looks like he got, I don't even know, like MMA fighters come out of their fights looking better than this guy. Because of how combative Esteban was during the arrest, and not only that, but he also unalived a fellow officer in an interrogation. So they're taking zero chances with Esteban at this point. They say, nope, you are getting shackled. And not only that, but he was biting and spitting. So they had to throw this Hannibal Lecter mask on him. And so that's where we get this video right here, where he's wearing this Hannibal Lecter mask and his family sees his face for the first time since he got arrested. Straight up whoop ass, dude. Like, they beat this guy's face to a bloody pulp. It is so swollen. It is so messed up. It's crazy. I feel bad for him in a way, but we'll never really know what exactly happened when those cops met up with him. We could imagine them being pretty frustrated and pretty mad that he just unalived one of their brethren from the force. And on top of that, if he was being combative, some cops take that as an opportunity to really unleash. Now, the police officer responsible for Esteban's face looking like that, his name is Christopher Zarella, and he says that when they arrived on scene and he was chasing Esteban on foot, he tackled him, and at that point, he knew that he was armed and dangerous because of what had just happened with Detective Allen, so he was already in fear for his life because of that, but then on top of that, he said he was kicking, punching, screaming, kicking all of the officers around him. And so he took that opportunity to make sure that he subdued him, and in doing so, he battered his face in. However, the official story is that the 3-story drop after he unalived Detective Allen from the police station is what caused his face to look like that. Now, unless he fell right on his face, like straight to the ground, I don't think that's true. As I mentioned before, they have multiple evaluations done on him from both the state and the defense side, trying to evaluate whether this guy is, number one, competent to stand trial, and then number two, whether he was insane. They have differing opinions, so ultimately it's up to the jury to decide based on the facts and the evidence that they see, what do they think needs to happen with this guy. And regardless, I think that most people on a jury are going to assume if he gets acquitted by reason of insanity, that he's just going to be released right back out on the streets, which isn't true. Even if they think that he's going to be, remanded to the custody of some sort of mental health organization, it still seems likely that he might get out sooner, and just the idea of this guy being back out on the streets probably freaks everybody out. But regardless of what all these evaluations say, the jury ends up siding with the prosecution's evaluation. The jury ends up siding with the prosecution, and they do find him guilty on all of the charges. I think probably one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that the jury probably saw was Madeline Gatta getting up there and testifying against Esteban, because initially she just thought that he had punched her in the back, but he actually stabbed her when he did that. And she survived this whole ordeal, but definitely left her in the hospital for a few days. It's crazy that she was able to testify against him, and it's absolutely crazy he would do that to an 84-year-old woman. Like, what kind of piece of human garbage are you? But because Rhode Island doesn't do the capital punishment thing, the harshest sentence that could be handed down for unaliving somebody. Now, Rhode Island doesn't participate in capital punishment, so the harshest sentence they could hand down for unaliving Detective Allen would be life without parole. And on June 27th, 2006, the jury does just that. They don't align at all with the defense's expert witnesses, and they decide to keep this guy off the streets. And I think that they see the true dangers that him possibly getting out could have. I mean, even if he is mentally ill, the guy needs serious help. Regardless, the jury decided that prison is where he will spend the rest of his days, and he has been at the Rhode Island Maximum Security Facility in Cranston since 2006. Esteban has tried, I think, 3 different appeals. The first one, he appealed just saying that he was in fact mentally ill and that his counsel didn't represent him properly. He appealed saying that they didn't appeal the initial case quickly enough. And then the last appeal was saying that he had ineffective counsel because they didn't appeal the case quick enough. And all of his appeals have been denied, and they've upheld the decision and kept him in prison, and his sentence remains. Now, the thing that I kept coming back to with this case that I just couldn't get my head around, the thing that I was really frustrated that I couldn't find more about, is his substance use and his substance abuse issues and his previous crimes. I wasn't able to find any of his previous crimes in any court record databases, which is kind of weird because there was a lot of previous crimes. but I'm not really sure. Maybe it's just because they didn't go through the court system. I'm not 100% sure. The thing with that gets me is I'm not sure if this mental illness that he was suffering from was substance induced, because substance abuse, and especially if you're lost in real serious substances, like real hardcore substances, they can literally mimic mental health disorders when you're in the throes of it. You are paranoid, you're schizophrenic, you act kind of jumpy and spazzy, you're very, very scared of things, you're very paranoid, you think everybody's out to get you. Oftentimes it can lead to psychosis where you're actually hearing voices and experiencing full-blown psychosis. And with all the conflicting psychiatric evaluations, like, it's just basically a bunch of information that still leads me to the same place as where I started. I have no idea whether this guy is actually crazy or if he's just like a substance abuser, an addict, essentially. I'm leaning more towards addict. And the thing with addiction is that if you already have any sort of mental health issues, the addiction is going to exacerbate it 20 times. So it's just going to get way worse if you start doing substances, especially if you start doing hardcore ones. Maybe both is true. I mean, two things can be true at the same time. Maybe he did have mental health issues and he was using substances which made it worse, which seems to be the case with most of the stories I cover. But in this case, it almost feels like it was situational. Like he would go through these periods where he wouldn't have these voices, he wouldn't feel crazy. And it was right around the time when he had his kids. And so usually that's when people tend to sober up. I know that's when I started trying to sober up, was when I had my son. So it just makes me think, it makes me wonder, maybe it was all substance abuse induced. And on top of that, we have the hospitals who have on multiple occasions denied him any sort of mental health treatment, saying that it's because it was induced by substance abuse. So he has a history of abusing substances, and the evaluation that the defense did, the conclusion that he came back with, saying that he had paranoid schizophrenic tendencies, was probably bipolar, had mood issues, those are all like side effects of substance abuse, 100%. And when your chemical imbalance is so strong up in your head, it's nearly impossible for you to not feel like you're psychotic or crazy, because you are at that point. You are chemically induced psychotic. Just something to consider. And for people who already have a predisposition to mental illness, like Esteban did in his family, it just opens the door to so many dark possibilities. And unfortunately, we see exactly those dark consequences and how they unfolded for Esteban. But if you're looking for a good Halloween costume idea, I think that the Hannibal Lecter mask being Esteban Carpio could be a good idea. But yeah, and hopefully the information on Halloween was interesting, because I thought that was interesting when I was researching it. I didn't know that before. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. I got a bunch of new Sober Sector merch. So if you want to support the channel, there is merch available. But yeah, if you want some cool Sober Sector merch, I got t-shirts, towels. I got these really cool like cell phone bags. I really want to get one. And yeah, just a bunch of stuff. Bunch of cool design stuff by yours truly. But yeah, like I said, if you want to support the channel, then grab some merch. The Sober Sector. But get you some merch. But I appreciate you guys sticking around this long and listening to me yap at you. And yeah, happy Halloween to all of you guys. Go trick-or-treating and get some candy and be safe, because I don't know if there ever was or ever will be razor blades in candy, but it's still something I'm legitimately scared of every year. So yeah, just be safe out there, you guys. And just remember, the boundary between the afterworld and this world is very thin. That's all I got for you guys. And happy Halloween. And if you guys need more sobering stories, I'll leave a couple of them right here. In fact, one of them will be a full playlist of all my stories. And I'll catch you guys next Friday for another sobering story. If you have ideas of who you want me to talk about, I'm always open to ideas, so drop me a comment. But later, sobers.
Oh my God. Let me show you what